let me now introduce Adriana Kemp. She's currently the chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Tel Aviv University. She's one of the leading immigration scholars in Israel. Her research addresses scholarship conducted at the crossroads of labor migration, citizenship, and civil society. She's the author of dozens of important articles and several books, and she's currently researching legal liminality in the life course of migrant workers and refugees' children in Israel. Thank you, Adriana, for agreeing to comment. This is for you.
Do I need it? I'm now investigating the next generation of the supply chain. Okay, so thank you very much. I enjoyed very much reading the article. Ila told me that there will be 3 of us. So actually, I prepared some comments in a very nonchalant way, and so bear with me. It's not a structured lecture.
More people came. It's not
no, it's so I have another problem. This was one problem. The other one is that I agree with most of what you wrote. So, and it's very difficult to engage in in some way to keep some gap between what you said and what I'm trying to. So I just give some comments and, thoughts that they depart actually from a deep agreement about the what you call the human supply chain, a very strong figure, a very strong trope, being a key structuring component in the global economy. I fully agree. I fully agree with your characterization of how easy it is actually to point at the bad guys and let the whole system and institutions and structure get away with murder. One thing I would like to say is that the human supply chain is also a key in striking the balance between the economics of migration and the politics of migration. And this is very important, and so are the bilateral agreements. So I think that the paper, Jennifer's paper, makes a strong case for something that scholars of migration know very well, and perhaps economists misrecognize, as you mentioned several times. And this is that the political economy of trade is not the same as the political economy of migration. Also, when we look at migration purely as labor, okay? That migrants are different from bananas, okay, which is a nice and colorful take. This is another article, a former article written by Jennifer, and thank you, Ila, for giving me the opportunity to read that. And I think this is a nice and colorful take, these migrants and bananas, on the fathers of modern economics, Adam Smith, that argues something very similar in the chapter, his chapter of wages on the wealth of nations. And he wrote that of all sorts of luggage, people are the more difficult to move. He was right. It's exactly that, because they're not bananas. Okay, so what would be my main point? The main thing I would like to make is that despite my deep agreement with the structural analysis of this chain, human supply chain, I think that we could do a little bit more regarding institutional factors. When we work about institutional factors, what do we want to do? We want to say, okay, we have structural commonalities. And why? Because the commonalities, which are connected to the structure, we very often have different results, different outcomes, or different paths. Okay, so this will be my main take on that. Okay, which actually it means that what I'm doing is I'm taking something that you write in the conclusion very seriously, which is, and I'm quoting you, Jennifer. You say the conclusion, there is no one blueprint for success, writing about the different options for regulating or regulating better the human supply chain. And you say there is no one blueprint for success. And I'm quoting, an effective approach to regulation of recruitment will depend on the geography and political economy of each country and the presence or absence of civil society organizations that can support collective action by migrants and advance their rights as workers. And unquote, and I fully endorse that view. So what does mean taking integrating further into the analysis, the structural analysis, institutional factors. So Yael has done a wonderful work because she has talked, for example, about neoliberalism, okay, and the whole set of institutions and institutional understandings of what does it mean, what is politics and what is policy. We don't call it policy anymore, we call it governance, okay? What is governance, okay? So my take could be a little bit on contextually institutional and historic. For example, let's think about the bilateral agreements that you mentioned as one way of regulating, that it's not the best one, but it's one of the ways, is the one that we have here at hand in the Israeli case, okay? So I think that one important thing here, taking into account how a human supply chain comes into being, is not just looking at the contradictions of capitalism. It's looking also at the contradictions between the institutions of capitalism, okay, and the dynamics of capitalism, of labor movement and products movement. So let's take, for example, the bilateral agreements. The bilateral agreements, we can differentiate quite clearly between, it's Avinoam Cohen here? No, it's a pity. He wrote a wonderful PhD. Yesterday I wrote the review. So he writes about actually 2 generations of bilateral agreements, and I agree with him fully. The first generation is the one that we know from the traditional guest worker programs, okay? Those that came into being a little bit earlier in the US with the Bracero, but then in Europe under the aegis of the Marshall Program, okay, after the Second World War. And one interesting thing when we look at the different models of how the recruitment was affected, okay? So, and I'm not talking only about the migrant workers that came from the periphery of Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece, which were the main. But I'm talking those that came really overseas, okay? And how were they recruited? The chain was, there was a chain, but it was very short, a very short and highly regulated, state-regulated chain. So, for example, you have here the French government, that they open a bureau, okay, a labor bureau, just across the pond, okay, just across the Mediterranean, okay, in North Africa. And that's how they recruited. So it was highly centralistic. It was like, opening an embassy, and the embassy was actually conducting the recruitment. Something similar happened with Germany. Germany did not send for private recruiters. They opened their own bureau in the places where they were recruiting, first of all from Italy, which was the great influx, the great big influx, and then later on also from Turkey. So this is one generation, and now what we're having now, and here is where Yael talk about neoliberalism comes. And this is an open question, okay, is how actually came into being a second generation of these bilateral agreements or transnational regulatory agreements in which actually the chain is extending even further. So you are having it's becoming more and more privatized. And when I talk about privatized, definitely I'm talking about, the small recruiter in the village, from the smaller one to the big ones that are private. Some of them are private corporations, and that therefore also the notion of industry is a very proper one. Okay, so the question is here, the first institutional question would be about the change in the policy paradigm, in the ways in which we understand, okay, what is a policy and what is labor migration policy. Okay, there is no one labor migration policy. It changes, and we have to take more into account the contextual one. The contextual here being more of a historic. The second point would be that, which I think it's also somehow institutional, it's structural, but it's also institutional. Power differentials. Definitely, when we talk, our starting point is that there are power differentials. We have to understand migration in terms of power differentials, inequality and power differentials. The recruitment, definitely the chain comes into being because of power differentials. The power differentials are not only economic power differentials, which are the obvious one, the push and pull factors, okay, and the differences in wages, but also political power, okay. Actually, the fact that there are political power differentials is what leads us to another assumption that it's very strong, that countries of destination are active agents in shaping unilateral forms of regulation. So also when we have bilateralism, okay, there is always a direction in bilateral agreements, okay? There is only the direction, and the direction, who gives the direction? The direction is mainly the recruiters, okay? The countries of destination. In the Israeli case, we can see how this assumption works with actually the only serious experiment so far of regulating the chain, which is the bilateral agreements. I will not go further into what you said already, Yael. Jennifer, you write about bilateral agreements more on your previous work, where you ask a very good question: why there are so many bilateral agreements? Okay, and I think that Avinoam, he counted something like 300 bilateral agreements around the world, which is, I mean, it means that there is something. Bilateral agreements regarding migration, I'm talking only. And I think that here in this article, you quite go, no? You skip it over, perhaps a bit with disregard. This is what we have, the experiment we have here, so I can just comment on that. I think that there are various, again, the institutional factors. There are different reasons for which destination countries, the strong part, okay, are interested or would be interested in having bilateral agreements. There is no one set of reasons. Sometimes they are, they aggregate together, but they can be very different, and they can be very different. What is really bothering them? What is really out there for which they could actually want a bilateral agreement? One would be definitely ensuring return, okay? Getting the countries of origin actually to be part of the control of the chain. Okay, that could be, and it's good enough. The other one, it would be controlling recruitment. And I think that in the case of Israel, controlling recruitment was one of the interests of controlling recruitment that went out of hand, actually. But I think that there is another one that it's also internal pressure. So it means that we have to go a little bit inside the state. For example, a very banal one, whether there is a lack or presence of courts. And if the migrant workers have also a standing before courts, okay. I think that there are also, of course, there are also external factors or external actors. Yael talked about the IOM, which actually here it's something of an hybrid, internal and external, okay. But in the case even of bilateral agreements and some changes, important changes in regulations, I think that, for example, the OECD has played an important role. So one question we could ask about the OECD, and I'm not a great fan of the OECD, that's not the case, but one important question, for example, is why the bilateral agreement that was signed with Thailand, and it started already in 2005, and in 2009 it was out there, it did not get signed. Why? But it got signed in 2010. And this is exactly the time where Israel was included or annexed to the OECD, because it was conditioned by the OECD that they have to do something about that. They have to do something about that because it was already out there, because civil society organizations have been forever working and pushing for the bilateral agreements and for doing something about the recruitment and the link between what here was called the binding system and the recruitment, the illegal mediation fees. Another thing that was very important actually has to do also with let's call it professional bureaucracies. I think that an important, alongside the human rights organizations and advocacy organizations, I think that a very important thing here is also the fact that you had people working from within the professional bureaucracies in the Ministry of Finance. I think that was crucial. Okay, the Eckstein report and within the Ministry of, not the politicians, but the economists and those working in the bureaucracies, that they had been pushing forever. They wanted to stem the undocumented migration, okay? And they pushed forever and very strongly for the bilateral agreements and for actually banning and dismantling the recruitment mediators, the recruitment industry. Okay. Now, another point. Most of the analysis regarding, if I go on with the bilateral agreements, most of them actually, when we talk about bilateral agreements, we talk very often about at the aggregate level of countries. And we say states, but actually, the state is, like an actor, like a unitary actor, and definitely migration, this is part of migration diplomacy, bilateral agreement, so it's interstate. But I think that regulation, the exact shape that regulation takes, and this will go even further beyond the bilateral agreements, which is only one tool, is deeply influenced by things that are happening within countries, within the state. So we have to look into the black box of the inside the state, okay? That was the name of Kitty Calavitas, okay? One thing, for example, interministerial politics, okay? They are competing, they have different agendas, different outlooks, different interests, and so on, and I think this is very important. I mentioned before the Minister of Finance. Their interests were different from the interest of the Ministry of Interior, and indeed, in this case, good, because they are stronger than them, okay? And of course, I could bring zillions of examples of the different interests of the Ministry of Labor and Welfare work together, and then they change, and so on and so forth. Another one, which is one of our favorite, I wrote here with Rebecca Rachman, cross-sectoral politics. Come on, I think that this is a major thing. Okay, cross-sectoral politics, I'm talking about. One interesting question would be why we have bilateral agreements with agriculture, but we have only pilot with the largest sector from which migrant workers are recruited, which is the care workers. Okay, so I think this is a very pertinent question, and it has much to do with the cross-sectoral politics, whether it's group interest politics or whether it's clientelistic politics or all of Gary Freeman's very well-known article. Okay, I could go on and on, but so another thing, and perhaps this would be my last point, about the dynamics of human supply chain as a key aspect in structuring documented migration, the temporal schemes of labor migration, but for those that are documented. And you start your article with a very strong argument, saying, look, the numbers of undocumented migrants are diminishing, but at the same time nobody's paying attention that the temporary schemes have come back big time. And I can see and I can understand the political rationale and behind that argument, which is a very strong, first of all, it's a state of fact, but second of all, it's also a very strong argument, political argument. But what I would say here, and I'm sure that you will agree, but just I want to make the point, is that I think that the divide between documented and undocumented in general, it's not so clear. It's never clear. That's true. But I think that the human supply chain works particularly at the crossroads or at the blurred line. It works at the blurred line between the documented and undocumented. Okay, so for example, it's obvious that many illegal acts have to be committed to become a legal worker, labor migrant. This is obvious, I hope. Perhaps the other way around it's less obvious, but we know it. All of us that work in this area know it very well, and it's the fact that the human supply chain creates illegalization. It can be actually, when you have high recruiting fees, you have bonded labor, or people that are, they have loans to repay, okay? They have to cover the costs of their things, so it creates illegalization. Whether, by force, because you overstay your visa, this would be one obvious and very recurrent phenomena, and the other one, because someone is taking advantage of that. So, for example, a very well-known phenomena in Israel has been the flying visa. Remember the flying visa? So this is a shtick that they invented. So what is the flying visa? The flying visa was that actually the recruitment, the part of recruitment and illegal fees, mediating fees, was so profitable that people actually were just doing the recruitment, including employers, okay, or employers with someone else. They were just doing the recruitment, and they didn't have even to employ for one day the construction worker or the care worker. Why? Because they had already their share. Actually, it was a liability employing them. So they would actually bring them with visas that were issued by the Ministry of Interior, and they were bringing them with visas, and the next day after they arrived, they found that they were actually fired, that they didn't have a job. But at the moment that they didn't have a job, they became deportable. So this was actually a main part of the industry using the quota system and using the permit system. Okay? Another point regarding this one, and with this I'll finish, I think that you mentioned, Jennifer, that the dynamics of human supply chain are key in structuring documented migration, because documented migrants or prospective documented migrants actually are in contractual relations already with employers. But here this is an open question. It depends, I think, I go back to institutions. It depends very much on how the relations, employer-worker relations, are defined by legal institutions, by legislation, for example, labor legislation in different countries. In Israel, for example, being undocumented doesn't mean that you are not in contractual relations. You are in contract for many, under labor laws, you are covered under many labor laws from day one, very important, which actually create this contractual relation from day one, even if you're undocumented, and even if you never have a permit for work. So I think that with that it would be enough. And I would like to listen more about Radar, that I think that it perhaps is similar to CIMI's hotline. Don't know. We'll see. Thank you.